I missed the order again. So Fiona goes first and then...
Yourself second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I'm just waiting for people to join, but I can't see participants at the same time as I'm sharing my screen. So far, all I have is Daniel that has joined us, I think, but it's only right on 2 o'clock. Oh no, we have 16 participants. So good afternoon for this seminar by Interlink, the International Network for Transport and Accessibility in Low-Income Communities. This is the second of our seminar series, which started last year during lockdown, and we found that they were so successful that we decided we would run another series. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes for people to join, but the timing is quite tight. So we're not going to take a lot of time to let people come in. But I just want to introduce you to our speakers, who are Fiona Raje from Manchester Met, Metropolitan University, Juan Carrasco and Alejandra Rasse from Universities of Conception and Católica, and Ajay Bailey from Utrecht University. And I'll shortly be passing over to Sami, who is from University of Cape Coast in Ghana, who has currently got a name called Emersonova on his thing, but that's Sami there. Wave to us, Sami. And he will be the chair for the rest of the session. And Regina, also from the same university, who will be the discussant and lead the discussion at the end. We'll have 3 presentations, and we'll take all questions in the chat, and then have a discussion and question session at the end of the program. So this is called New Horizons and New Perspectives. And I'll quickly stop sharing from there on in so that we can allow the first speaker, Fiona, to upload her slides. Thank you very much, and look forward to participating in the seminar.
Thank you, Emma, and welcome to all our distinguished guests and participants once again. So our first session in the series will highlight the work of our partners who are working in locations the network has not yet fully explored. As Interlink continues to expand its membership and activities globally, we have exciting new opportunities to broaden understandings of transport and accessibility for low-income communities in Chile, India, and the Caribbean. So this afternoon, morning, evening session, we are going to have 3 presentations. The first will be delivered by Fiona Raje from Manchester Metropolitan University, and then she will have 15 minutes to present on Just Beyond Paradise. After her, we will take presentation from Ajay Bailey from the University of Utrecht, who will be presenting on inclusive cities through equitable access to urban mobility infrastructure for India and Bangladesh. After which we'll take our last presentation on CEDEUS urban laboratories, refocusing urban accessibility on the micro scale by Juan and Rasse. So without wasting much time, I will ask Fiona to start. Over to you, Fiona. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Sammy, and thank you, Karen and Emma, for organizing. Okay, so I'm going to just close down my own face, if you don't mind, because it's distracting me. If I can. I'm here to talk to you about the Caribbean. And we've all seen the images of the Caribbean. For example, the fun, the frolics, the sunshine, the turquoise seas, blue skies, happy people. Even in the picture here, James Bond, just a little bit of a cultural reference because it's opened in the UK the other day, looking out across the waters in Jamaica, although some of the other pictures are not from Jamaica. But behind the smiles, there's so much more. And I want to start by talking to you about a road. Now, not very clear on my map, but across here is a very light link. And this is called Gordontown Road, and it links the communities of Gordontown and Industry Village, just up here in the mountains, Blue Mountains, to the urban area of Kingston at a place called Papine, which doesn't really matter, but you can see University of the West Indies here, you can see Bob Marley's museum. And what I wanted to talk to you about is the fact that this link is so important for connecting rural livers further out and people in the peri-urban area to Kingston. And what happened to it last year? So in October and November 2020, Jamaica and Kingston in particular were affected by tropical storms Zeta and Eta. A large section ended up being washed away into the river valley of the Gordontown Road. This cut up the only viable link to the urban area, leaving people stranded, unable to go to work, school, or hospital. Delivery of goods, movement of garbage, everything came to a stop. And as an aside, the garbage truck used to carry more than just garbage down the hill. It used to also carry some of the ganja down from the farmers further up. Anyway, that's not really relevant to what we're talking about. So what happened? The link was lost and people couldn't move. So the government decided in its wisdom, instead of investing in the piece of road that had gone, the first thing they did was they went about upgrading this very tortuous path into the hills. It had been a dirt track that nobody really wanted to use. And people were very unhappy about this because they didn't want to use it. They felt it was unsafe. And sure enough, once it was opened and called passable, it was really only passable for the sort of well-heeled people in 4x4s and strong-hearted, fearless lorry drivers. People started to report and put on social media that no, they wouldn't use the road because there were several trucks and cars that overturned on it. And you had images in social media of people's vehicles falling off the road. Basically, the people who lived in the area wanted the government to invest in the road that they had seen fall away. So, people who had traveled on this road had been using a number of modes. They'd used things like scooters, motorbikes, lifts on the back of trucks, lifts in minibuses, cars, bicycles. But once this severance took place, I quickly developed a sideline for men with motorbikes. They would carry goods across the small breakaway, which you can see in the picture here, and charge people extortionate amounts of money for moving the goods, but also for moving people who were perhaps having to take a taxi to one side of the link and then get a taxi at the other side. So all of a sudden, transport became very difficult, if nigh impossible, and very expensive. So why am I telling you about this? Basically, in the time available, I just hoped that I would capture the essence of the challenges of a vulnerable population experiencing barriers to accessibility and mobility. Nothing I have said is unique to Jamaica or indeed to the Caribbean, and many of you will know of similar stories. Also, there are many other tales I could have told, but still, let's reflect a little more on the Caribbean. Around about 45 million people live in the region, and each nation therein possesses its own unique socioeconomic characteristics. So I'm very wound up when somebody comes back and says to me, I've been to the Caribbean, I went on a cruise, all of them look the same. No, absolutely they don't. And every island is different. And places like Guyana, which is on the mainland, also part of the Caribbean, looks very different. Basically, you have territories of the Netherlands, France, UK, and US in the Caribbean, but you have sovereign states also. And some are more developed than others. For example, Haiti, the second largest nation by population, is the poorest country in Western Hemisphere. On the other hand, down at the bottom of my map, which is really not very clear, Port of Spain is there. Trinidad and Tobago have recently been moved out of being considered developing countries by the OECD because their incomes have increased substantially. The gross national income per capita in the Caribbean varies from $800 US per year to over 30,000 in somewhere like Trinidad. The main sources of income tend to be tourism, but we also have things like oil in Trinidad. There's an active financial sector in Jamaica, and many places are dependent on agricultural employment. Before the pandemic, some of the islands were showing positive growth rate, but now there's been jobs lost, and the intensity of climate change has increased in the probability that they will be affected by more and more acts of God, as they're called in insurance policies. So there were 9 hurricanes at category 3 and above in 2019 to 20, many more than there used to be. When a hurricane or indeed an earthquake strikes, it can wipe out more than the annual GDP of a small island, and it is the poorest who suffer the most. In April 2021, the eruption of La Soufrière volcano in St. Vincent required massive evacuations and is having widespread impacts on the country's people, infrastructure, and economy. So what does all this mean for the mobility of vulnerable populations in the region? There need to be investments in infrastructure to meet people's daily needs. Large-scale foreign investment in toll roads, ports, and airports cannot solve day-to-day mobility needs of the vulnerable. Understanding the social, cultural, and economic lived experience of the vulnerable is important if we are trying to find out what the nuances are of their experience. And those nuances need to be fed into effective engagement and co-production of solutions by vulnerable people and practitioners. Without effective and efficient transport options and connectivity, it is difficult to see how individual vulnerable people can be included in well-intended regional, national, and urban development. I see the travel challenges of the Caribbean as similar to those in other parts of the global South. To me, it is important that practice and theory related to transport in the global South is made in the global South. It is unlikely that US and European models to solutions and perspectives can truly satisfy the needs of the unique context of the urban Caribbean. Equally, the context in one Caribbean country may not be at all similar to that in another. So while sharing of ideas and potential solutions is beneficial, there are no cookie cutter answers to be applied to all island states. This is why Latin American narratives can inform the Caribbean experience, but cannot be taken as representative of the uniqueness of the neighboring region. Nevertheless, it is through all of us sharing knowledge and practice that we may learn and do better in each area in which we are all concerned geographically. So for me, the mobility and access barriers in the Caribbean relate to poor transport links, a lack of infrastructure investment. Very often there's political conflict, and I talk from a Jamaican perspective about this, but it does happen in other places, whereby an MP is in power, he invests in his local area, but not looking at the wider picture beyond it, but looking purely for voters to come back and bring him back in. So the need may be in an adjacent constituency, and there may need to be a link between the two, but that is not seen, or it's seen but ignored. I believe also that people are challenged by a poverty that individuals experience, economic, the loss of family who move abroad or move to cities, and within those cities experience an awful lot of crime. This affects households, communities, resources, and people's modal choices. So if we move back to Jamaica specifically as a small island developing state, the things that perhaps exacerbate the barriers that people face are vulnerability to weather events, a rising car dependence. In the 1990s, the Jamaica experienced a tripling of car ownership. And some of those cars, I can anecdotally tell you, because I was there, were coming in at the different ports, and parts of the car would come in at, say, Montego Bay, and others come into Kingston, and then they get welded together. And they're avoiding all the regulations that are in place in the country, and they're then on the road, and there's a high incidence of crashes, and that continues today. With that rising car ownership and old cars being on the road, there is an increase in air pollution. There is also the effect of crime. For example, if you have bicycles, great to use, and they are used in urban areas, but they will be stolen as well, both when parked and from you while you're on the bike. So that's just my observations, but I really am now going to turn to all of you and ask you, what can we do to help vulnerable urban populations in the Caribbean? We would like to set up a Caribbean mobility network to enable exchange of ideas, to also focus on tangible evidence of what can be done and what is being done. If we want it to be as inclusive as possible, we want, sorry, I just noticed a hand going up. I'll come to you in a minute, Tanu. We're planning to have a workshop to get to know each other, share ideas, and start off the network. And please don't think that because I've said other solutions can't be applied in the Caribbean because it's only Caribbean people who can do it. No, I don't really mean that. I mean that we should allow people to make their decisions in their own areas, but they need to find out what other people are doing. So even if you have nothing to do with the Caribbean, you've never been, I still encourage you to join, but I really need help with the name. So if anybody has a better idea than Caribbean Mobility Network and who's willing to work with me or do whatever, please let me know. Finally, I'll leave you with a recent photo of downtown Kingston. You'll see the cars, you'll see there's shopping going on. That is how downtown Kingston looks, and I'm very familiar with that. But I also wanted to leave you with the words of one of Jamaica's most well-known sons. And it isn't Robert Nesta Marley, it's Jimmy Cliff. From his song, Wonderful World, Beautiful People, take a look at the world and the state that it's in today. I'm sure you'll agree, we all could make it a better way. With our love put together, everybody learn to love each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. You were just right on
Just
time.
stop sharing for you, Sammy.
Yes, thank
There
you
you
very
go.
much. Thank you. Thank you. So we will defer the questions, the discussions to the discussion session, and then move to our next presentation by Ajay Bailey from the University of Utrecht. And he is going to present on inclusive cities through equitable access to urban mobility infrastructures for India and Bangladesh, EQUIMO. So, Ajay, you have 15 minutes to present.
Great.
And start now.
Thank you, Sami. Thanks also to the network for inviting me. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I'm very happy to present our project, EQUIMOB as we call it, and it's called the Inclusive Cities Through Equitable Access to Urban Mobility Infrastructures, and for India and Bangladesh and specific cities, not the whole countries in that sense. And this project is funded by the Dutch Research Council and Utrecht University. And okay, I hope this works. Yes. So this is the team that's with us across the different groups. Maybe some people you could recognize. I see Karan already smiling over there. And some of our PhDs and postdocs are also there as attendees in the session. So they may also would like to share these ideas. So what I'm going to do today is, of course, present a kind of an overview of why we went into this project, what are we hoping to find, and give brief snapshots from each of the sites. So the objective was, so to begin with, I'm not a transport researcher. So I'm a demographer and an anthropologist by training, right? So why did I come to a transport-oriented project? So we worked a lot with older adults in India and around healthcare access and these kind of issues. And what we saw over there, it was not about affordability or about knowledge about accessing care. It was just the physical element of not being able to reach these healthcare institutions. And that prompted us to look at what kind of transport inequalities exist. And that's how we started writing these proposals to look at the physical and social barriers to urban transport and what are the implications thereof. And also to develop and contextualize measures to improve access to work, healthcare, and social life. And as many of you know, in the Global South, just because you're 60 plus doesn't mean you don't have, you still have to go to work, you still have to earn a livelihood. So access to buses, access to public transport is still quite crucial. What we want to do at the end of this project is to co-design an inclusive urban mobility framework, an evaluative framework which we can present, working with different stakeholders on kind of guidelines that are necessary for creating such inclusive spaces, especially in transport infrastructures. Our key concepts, of course, we would like to look at motility because it's not just about the competence of accessing these services, but also appropriation of this mobility. And with much of healthcare literature, that's where we come from the beginning, access is always seen from an affordability perspective. And we wanted to go further to look at access from a transport perspective, but also access to transport from this 4A framework. We take an intersectional approach because we don't look at, in this project, we have 3 categories. So women, older adults, and people with disabilities. But we don't look at them as individual islands, but rather a combination of that. An older woman with some amount of disability living in a low-income household would face many more barriers, both physical and social, to reach her destination in that sense. So that kind of gives the broader framework under which we look at transport inequalities. Our approach, we take a multi-sited mixed method approach. So we use both visual surveys, GPS-led geo-narratives. This was a bit compromised because in the last year with the whole COVID thing, we hardly could go into the field to do this, but we hope next year we could do these things. The cities we focus on, in the original proposal, we started off with Delhi, Bengaluru, and Dhaka. And we have now added Kolkata because we have new data and a new researcher who has joined the project. And why these cities? Why not other cities? My question. Because if you put them on a continuum of urban mobility infrastructures, Delhi has more options and more developed as compared to Dhaka, for example, on the other. So, and what we want is that instead of comparing Delhi to Amsterdam or to some other place, there needs to be more south-south comparison and learning of best practices that work and do not work. What issues on best practices or on inclusion, around gender, around violence that people see within these south-south cities, can these cities learn from? What can Dhaka now learn from inclusion of the starting of the new metro that Bangalore and Delhi have already learned about? So that's the idea behind this comparison. And as I said earlier, we look at these 3 or 4 groups, especially from low-income neighborhoods. And the idea for the framework is that we want to compare the user information and the stakeholder information together, because we want to understand urban mobility from both the user perspective, but also from the provider's perspective. To see where are these barriers, where are the elements that people don't talk to. For example, with the Dhaka Transport Municipal Corporation or Transport Authority, we actually went to have only one session with them to understand where do they see these problems. For them, they said, yeah, we have all the intentions, but there are so many buses on street. What can we do about it? You know, so it's about managing, it's about policies, and how do they see it from a provider's perspective. Ultimately, to come to this framework, which would have these methods and tools to recognize these barriers, skills and design changes, and not major design changes, even if including a small rubber strip that will help access getting into the bus. That could already improve access for older adults who have some issues around mobility or walking into the bus in that sense. I'll go quickly into the cities. So we first start with Delhi. In Delhi, we focused, our researcher Sakshi Joshi is working over there, and we focused on a low-income neighborhood. What you see over here is that many of you all may have also experienced it. If the neighborhood is not recognized by the municipality, you don't have any services, right? So accessing transport or going to the major transport hubs is already quite difficult for someone who's living here. You know, so they have to rely on other kinds of like auto rickshaws or motorbikes and other things to reach the main hubs. So transport may be affordable for that person from the main road, but to get to the main road is already quite expensive for many of them. So they may have to walk larger distances to do this. And you combine that with issues around that women cannot go out in the evenings or it's not safe for them. This further complicates access into the main roads. In Dhaka, we work, Salim Jahangir is our postdoc over there, and he focuses on older adults. A recent paper that we published in the Gerontologist looks at how do people actually experience, what is that lived experience of using a bus or these transport mechanisms? Why do they feel feverish? You know, it's the fact that it's not about just the bus or the crowd, it's the whole bodily reaction to accessing these services. And how over a period of time, this process can have long-term impacts in terms of increasing anxiety, increasing stress among older adults. And safety as another issue as well. Safety, I found very interesting what Fiona said is that you maybe, when you're riding your bike, also your bike may be stolen. So in the same case, when you're sitting in an auto rickshaw, also you could be robbed. And if you see over here in Dhaka, they would have these coverings. I found that very interesting. Coming from India, I was like, why would they have these enclosed spaces? It would be so suffocating. But then I realized it's a safety issue. Right? But it's also ingenious bottom-up approaches to create these safe spaces, right? In Dhaka, we also focus on women, and Mauri is our researcher over there. I don't know if you see her picture. Yeah. So she focuses on women, and with her, we used a different approach. We started first with the larger kind of systematic review of safety interventions across South Asia. And then we moved to look at what does the media think about it? How is media reporting about violence against women in transport? Who is the blame on? Who's the risk? I mean, who are seen as risky people and these kind of things. So we combine different elements or different viewpoints to arrive at the same understanding around women and safety issues. In Bengaluru, we work with Prajwal and Divya, who focus mainly on older adults. Over here, the larger discussion is on mobility itself, from door-to-door mobility, and also risky crossings. Literally over here, if you have to get to the bus stand, you have to cross this busy street, and the risk of being hit by a bus, if you're walking slowly, if you have some kind of issues with sight, all these things complicate access to infrastructures. You may have very good bus frequency, but if there are no safe passages to cross the roads, you still don't get to where you need to go to accessing healthcare, for example. In the last city that we focus on is on Kolkata. And here we take a different approach. We look at the first and last mile connectivity, because we saw that a lot of the discussion was about accessing transport infrastructure when you reach the infrastructure. But actually, what happens before that? How do you make sure that there are safe passages in the first and last mile connectivity? Who are all involved? You may have very good transport metro systems which have lifts and access and ramps and everything. But once you get out of that metro, is there enough facilities available to reach your home? I mean, if you get out of the metro and if the footpath is too big to get off from your wheelchair or to use your wheelchair to go around it, or for women, if it's too dark in the night because the lighting stops at the metro station but doesn't go any further than that, that's a big issue. In this paper that we published in the cities, we look at how do women negotiate safety and public space and male gaze. In a sense, they also are constantly negotiating in this first and last mile journeys about who is risky, whom should I be scared about, how do I need to change my route by doing this. So all of this and the microaggressions involved around unwanted touch, abuse, verbal abuse, all these things have a major impact, which you see now in the Indian context also, that many women are actually dropping out of the labor force, not because they don't have access to these jobs, because it's these kind of everyday microaggressions actually cause much more anxiety and stress than large kind of violence related issues per se. So what did we learn? Of course, I gave you all a bit of this snapshot across these different places. What we see is we need to maybe start talking about transport access from a rights perspective. It's not that it's there or it's some kind of a charitable thing. It's just that it's a right of these individuals to access safe transport. And to bring back this focus on the public, in a sense, in this public transport. Who is this public? Is it only able-bodied people who are seen as public? Or are we looking at other groups as well? What intersectional groups we need to take into account to make this public concept more inclusive? What we want to do, and we're trying this in Bangalore now, or Bengaluru, is to work with commuter and commuter advocacy groups through creating these kind of city labs where we want to co-create information or co-create solutions, which these commuter advocacy groups can take back to bus associations or train associations or transport associations, so that we co-create this information, but it's their advocacy to ask for. So in the long run, it becomes more sustainable beyond this project in that sense. What we have also learned is involving stakeholders earlier in the process, especially before we design these individual proposals and research questions, helped us a lot, because then the packaging of the results becomes much easier. Towards the end, I would say that transport inequity, it kind of it's for us, or at least for me also in a sense, was an eye-opener, because we were not only talking about transport inequity, because it started to open doors to understand other hidden disadvantages which we see, which are not directly relevant when we are talking about the income inequalities. Transport inequalities showed us issues around emotional issues, emotional disadvantages, care gaps that exist with older adults, issues around violence, issues around microaggressions, issues around access to resources for care. So when they start to talk about transport, they're also talking in a larger sense of these other inequalities. This is our website. We have a lot more information there on our project and a lot of infographics. Please feel free to have a look at it. I'll stop now. I think I'm on time.
Thank you. Thank you, Ajay, for your presentation and for keeping to the time as 15 minutes exactly. Thank you very much. So we'll take our last presentation by Juan and Alejandra. They are presenting on CEDEUS urban laboratories, refocusing urban accessibility on a micro scale. So over to you, Alejandro and Juan. 15 minutes.
Okay, many thanks for the introduction. Well, my name is Juan Antonio Carrasco, and together with Alejandra, we will be presenting the experience of CEDEUS. CEDEUS is the Center of Urban Sustainable Development. It's a very large project financed by the government. And this is very important for us. We have received for 9 years, $1 million per year for research and impact. We are finishing our project next year, and we're starting to think about impact, what we have done. It's like a reflection upon this. I think in academic, we tend not to do so much about this, and I think it's very important to do it. So Alejandra belongs to the Catholic University, myself from Concepcion, but both of us belong to this project. And what we want to really focus here is on 3 key things. The first of all, I just want to give a very brief overview about what CEDEUS, and especially the urban labs, which is a key thing about this talk. Not to say that we are the best in the world and we are doing a very great project, but just as a reflection of what we are going to do in terms of going to the field and what we have learned and what we are thinking about could have been better. And then we will present 3 case studies. I will present 1, Alejandra 2 of them, and then starting to reflect on some learnings and basically a work in progress thinking in terms of learnings regarding this. So just very, very brief, what we have said to the reviewers. We have international reviewers who look at our work and our funders from the government. What is our objective is to articulate, and I put here in blue, the keywords that for us are very important. First of all, articulate relevant stakeholders, which is again a key question. Who are them? In urban development within specific territorial contexts, and the specific here is very important. We don't try to make general overviews of the territories we are going, but we go to very specific neighborhoods and places. Integrated spaces for participation and dialogue with communities, and applying co-design methodologies to carry out research and public policies. It's a very, very ambitious goals. And for that reason, we have set up what we call a policy and practice unit, which is basically a number of professionals who work together with the researchers in the field to really try to make the difference. And in particular, we have 2 programs, one related to an observatory in terms of indicators, another one who looks at active citizenship, especially for high school students, but we are focusing here on the urban laboratories, which is going to specific places. And starting from that, let me show you the first case study. This is in San Pedro de la Paz, which is a municipality in Concepcion. Concepcion is the second largest city in Chile, 800 kilometers south. And we went to this municipality to be part of a local plan of action that the municipality was taking place. And I'm just showing this because I think it's very important for me to show the context where we set up the linkages with the policymakers. They had this project. They thought on 4 silos in terms of waste management, water efficiency, and energy efficiency, and mobility and access to local services. And we went invited to one of them in terms of looking at mobility and access to local services. Well, what happened? Just let me give you a context of this place. This is a greater in the left side. You see the Greater Concepcion area. In the arrow is the area we're looking at here. This is a survey made by a Chilean NGO. The redder, the higher the social vulnerability in the area. So you can see we're at one of the most vulnerable areas in the metropolitan area. This is an area photograph prior basically the construction of the social housing that took place in this specific neighborhood that we are working. So you can see very empty spaces where they basically were where they made the specific housings over there in a very dense environment. And then you can see actually the context. This is prior the social housing, and then the new basically social housing around that. But then the facilities just put in place basically anywhere, wherever that could be feasible. There was no linkage with where the people lived or accessibility. And then you can see the green areas, which is basically small green areas. And we were interested in looking at walkability and trying to depart from the traditional walkability definitions from the literature in terms of just measuring indicators, but trying to see experience of walking. For that, we looked at, first of all, participatory mapping. We looked at in groups. And one of the interesting things here was that we explicitly worked with municipal officers in the groups. So basically, they were the facilitators as well. We wanted also to show them new things of getting information that they used to have it in a more quantitative way and a more traditional way as well. So we did a participative workings, commented works. We look at different dimensions as well: inclusion, encountering, connectivity, security, and safety. We use an application that helps to look at infrastructure. And what we found in this case was, of course, there were landmarks, there were destinations and purposes. But the more interesting thing here was that the usual routes, you can do this with GPS or very sophisticated things. We did it by talking. We're starting to find daily issues that were not necessarily related with transport infrastructure. They were related with the other issues that the municipality in the first instance considers as silos, like garbage dumps or safety. And then things like closures, the different places in the neighborhoods tend to close and at the end of the day, forming gated communities and segregating the spaces. That was very, very important, and the municipality just did not have the idea of what was going on in that sense. The similar, when you look at infrastructure, you see here a cycle path and pedestrian path, but basically infrastructure that has nothing to do with the environment or with the needs related with the urban environment. And then we found, on the one hand, recovered places for children and empty playgrounds. Again, most of them not only related with the urban environment, also related with the key landmarks. So the recovered places were close to the key landmarks. The empty playgrounds were not. But then this lack of linkage between policies was, of course, something that we could expect a priori, but was very important to show as a tool. And then security, even wild dogs, things that not necessarily are part of our usual conversation came out here. For example, in this map, you can see in yellow generalized insecurity that basically did not allow to cross for an important part of the neighborhood, or places that may be very nice in terms of infrastructure, but that were very dangerous in terms not only of safety, but of security. And then security tend to have an important part of the conversation. The downside of this is that yes, the municipality knew about that. We gave a report. I think most of the technicians of that knew about this, but then they answer with eco squares or nano squares to make physical activity, but not so much in terms of looking at these landmarks. Then again, of course, the seed is there, but then also the frustration of what is feasible not for the policymakers. Then I turn to Alejandra that will look at the next two cases.
Hello, everyone. I will present you the next two cases. The second case is San Eugenio neighborhood. San Eugenio is a neighborhood located in downtown Santiago. Santiago is our main city, 6 to 7 million inhabitants. Decades ago, it was an industrial area, and people living there were workers in different productive activities developed nearby. Next. Today is an elderly people neighborhood. In consequence, even though it's well located, close to all kinds of urban opportunities, most people living there experience several difficulties moving around, uneven or narrow sidewalks, high traffic avenues, narrow internal street used by trucks, congestion, among others. In this context, for an important part of their inhabitants, streets are perceived as dangerous to walk, and are not a good place to socialize. In this context, next, we work with Santiago municipality to develop a mobility plan for this neighborhood. We work in collaboration with different organizations, the local school, a church organization, elderly people organization, neighbors association, heritage defense organizations, among others, using the complete street model. And we develop a participative plan, next, focus on one, improving walkability, giving more space to it. Two, recognizing neighborhood industrial heritage through heritage routes or commemorative plaques, promoting spaces of sociability among neighbors through calming traffic devices, and promote internal safety mobilities. The case number 3, Juan. This case is about children in urban renovation areas in Santiago de Chile. 3 years ago, we started a long-term collaboration with the Ministry of Housing in urban renovation issues. Since the 80s and for 2 decades, our housing policy built almost 1 million of small, low-quality housing units for low-income families. Today, those areas are involved in deep process of urban decay. And the Housing Ministry has recently developed an urban renewal program, but it doesn't pay attention to specific population like women or children. In CEDEUS, we decided to contribute to this process by developing a diagnostic process and proposal emerging from the children. We selected one urban renewal project in one of the most deteriorated territories in Santiago City and worked through several months with the public school located in that neighborhood. Next. We conducted 4 workshops with 8th grade students, coordinating the diagnosis process with the geography and social science school curriculum. The last workshop was oriented to redesign a small square near the school, and the elements the children incorporated were considered in the final design. Next. This is the square we finally designed with the children. The year after this, we decided to broaden this work, including an urban diagnosis of housing and mobility spaces. This time, we work with 7th grade students in 2 schools, focusing on everyday mobilities and favorite neighborhood spaces. In parallel, we conducted observation of housing spaces, supplemented with open interviews with caregivers. Next. we were able to conclude that the daily life of these children and their caregivers were deeply confined because they faced several obstacles to move more than 2 or 3 blocks around their homes. For small children, women that carry a baby, or women taking care of several children while carrying bags, an uneven sidewalk, the lack of tree shadow, dogs, or the lack of pavement in winter are obstacles difficult to overcome to move. To these material difficulties, we have to add the fear of being in open spaces in a territory that is deeply affected by drug dealing and crime. These obstacles to mobility deepen the inequities that children and caregivers in urban decay territories have to face. They live in neighborhoods that have very few opportunities to offer and also have difficulties to go out of them. In terms of private space, houses, as you can see, are small and crowded, and usually children don't have their own space, don't have the possibility to personalize their space, and have no privacy, and the same happens to caregivers. In this context, we also found informal communitarian strategies in childcare. Neighbors help each other to be able to have time to cook, to go to the market, and other daily activities. This is an important resource for caregivers, but is fragile and depends on confidence and trust, and is not present in every neighborhood. Next. Based on these 3 cases, we want to share with you 3 main issues. The first is the importance of microscale when we are discussing accessibility. Usually, we identify the neighborhood as a microscale. We consider 6, 8, even 10 blocks as a walkable distance. We assume people move at least through all the neighborhood, but some groups are much more fixed in space. For these people, daily life is solved within 2 or 3 blocks around their houses. Moving more than that is considered extraordinary, something that they do once a week or even less. In some neighborhoods, these people might represent around half of the total population, so it's not a few people. So here we have a challenge. On one hand, it's important to think about how to amplify the scale in which they move. The elements that tie them to their houses are specific territorial conditions, security, sidewalks, dogs, etc. Thinking mobility and urban design on a micro scale may contribute to the autonomy of elderly people, children, and caretakers. Additionally, incorporating spaces especially designed for community care, in which care and other reproductive responsibilities might be solved in a communitarian way. This kind of solution will contribute to improving the well-being and autonomy of all these people. On the other hand, it's important to improve the city these people are living in. If you solve your life in 3 blocks, those blocks are your city. So what can we do to improve the city they live on that scale? It's obvious that it's obvious that we cannot guarantee accessibility to all kinds of infrastructure and urban services, but we can give to that area the attributes their inhabitants want, that are simple. Open space that is safe to play, a space in which you can walk around, etc. Next one. The next. From the second lesson we can share with you is that working in solving real problems implies working with real people, and in this participation becomes essential. Next. When we work in academic research, making participative research design is an option. But in these cases, when you are going to transformate a place, people have expectation, interest, emotions. So it's important to taking in a different role in the research team and involve them in all the decision-making processes. And this implies both a political review of the process, but also the generating of new participatory methods. Methods must be specifically designed for the group, so children participate in a different way than elderly people, and it implies, for example, do an app, make different methods to make them participate, to empower them. And the instruments have to recognize the differences. I will give the last minute to Juan Antonio.
Thank you, Alejandra. Just to wrap up and just all the three challenges that I would like maybe just to come in the discussion. On the one hand, there are some academic challenges, of course, new methodologies, and even for the academic career, usual metrics and incentives to perform field work is something that we have faced. But in terms of what also the case studies show, to which extent we really know about co-designing, the expectations, the timings that the local communities have tend to be very complicated to sort out on this regard. And finally, in terms of the public sector, to which extent we're really capable of measuring and identifying impact of this kind of projects and interventions. And then, of course, the issues related to political cycles and fragmentations that make things more difficult and challenging, but also interesting as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll now zoom into the discussion session, and I will invite Regina from the University of Cape Coast to lead the session for us. Regina.
Thank you very much, Sami, for this opportunity, and thank you, Interlink, for giving us this opportunity to come in. I've enjoyed all the presentations so far, and I believe that all participants have too. The issues raised are quite important to the discourse of mobility, most importantly, when every one of them has centralized on participation, and also trying to look out for home-breed solutions and involving the people that we think we have. I think it is quite dynamic. It's something that it is good, and Interlink must pursue. So going back to Fiona, Fiona brings out very important issues on how vulnerability sometimes can be exacerbated by negative climatic influences and impacts, and how the beautiful island of Jamaica, we hear Jamaica and we think about very beautiful shores and all that, and how some what we will put as acts of God, some challenges have actually plunged Jamaica, some cities in Jamaica, into making them inaccessible for people. She identifies the widespread disastrous effects on people's mobility, and she also raises the issue of trying to understand this from a social dimension, and also to understand people's lived experience. I think this is very, very important to bring on board. And it runs through all the presentations that we've brought in. She talks about inclusivity at the regional and the national levels as well, and identifying the homegrown solutions that can actually help work things out. And with this, she's trying to bring on board a team or a network for the Caribbeans to also come together to see how they can actually act on this, and also to
So it seems like maybe we've got a bit of a connectivity issue here with Regina. I did suggest that maybe if she turns her camera off, that might help. But we can't at the moment hear you, Regina, at all. So I think you were summing up quite nicely around Fiona and issues around climate change. I'm still not hearing you. I would say similarly, some of the things that have come to notice. No, I think, Regina, we can't hear you. It's not working. You have to switch your camera off. I think also similarly, we were looking here at the work of AJ, and I was hearing lots of comments around. So, Regina, are you back now?
Yes.
So,
Is it better?
Much better.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
So could you perhaps like now move
Thank
on
you.
to rounding up around what you have to say about AJ and.
Hello?
Regina, continue, please.
Please continue.
Okay. All right. Great. So looking at AJ's work, it has spread across cities in India and then Bangladesh. They worked in Delhi, in Dhaka, Bangalore, and Calcutta. I think that these issues also were very important, and the fact that they were also focusing on bringing in the local people was also very, very important. He brings in the issue of access and availability, affordability, and then acceptability of urban mobility, which are four key factors that we need to bring into the discourse. And most importantly, also looking at the issue of mobility using a right-based approach is quite dynamic, and it is something that I think is breathing in new life into Interlink, and that's something that we will have to look at. But to AJ, there were some things that I wanted you to look at. There was a key thing about how the media was facilitating a blame game, and I really didn't get how they were actually doing this. I don't know if you will come in to get us a little on how they were facilitating this in the discourse. Hello.
Yes. Karen, are we collecting questions and then we start a discussion, or do we go? You're muted.
Yes, we are actually in the discussion. The others that I'll raise along the line. So
okay, great. So this is some work that we're doing with Maori, and their primary interest is to look at how is the media framing the message. You know, when it comes to women and violence, is it talking about this woman was raped or was abused on the transport, or does it say this man abused or violated this woman on this particular thing? How is the media terming these messages? How are these messages talking about? Are they talking about these poor illiterate people who are coming into the city who are doing this, or are they talking about men who feel they have the right over the public space of the transport space that they're doing? So it's also about these discussions, and we compare across both English language newspapers and both Bangla language newspapers to see how this discourse is emerging. You know, there is also this focus on who is finally to take an action, because everyone gives a suggestion they should be doing something, but we want to find out through this discourse who are all these people pointing their fingers to. You know, in that sense, media plays a big role in creating this, in a sense that by reporting it in a particular way, they also normalize such behaviors, which we have to avoid by taking out the issue or calling it out and saying that this is not how you report on these issues, or how can you report more in an inclusive manner when you're dealing with transport infrastructures. I think that was a bit of our input about why we took media analysis into it.
Okay. Thank you very much, AJ. I was looking at how we could even bring them in as key stakeholders to change the narrative, basically, because I think they have a very important role that they can actually play in all of this. How do we harness their potential to change the narrative in these cities?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because that's how we hope towards the end, when we're creating this evaluative framework, we can bring the media along as well, because that would also bring this kind of representation of transport inequalities in the newspapers, in the media, and how that is presented. And we are talking only of newspaper media now, whereas there's so many other forms of media that plays a role, like social media, blogs, user created content, for example. All this also plays a particular role in changing the discourse.
All right, thank you very much, AJ, for these inputs that you've made. I was also looking at your stakeholders that you mentioned, the urban planners, the transport companies, but then I also know that within this region, we actually have a lot of informal transport, but I didn't see this in. Is that an issue in these cities, and how are you bringing them on board on your project to inform some of the issues that are cropping out of your work?
Yes, it is quite a challenge, I should say, that to bring informal companies into account, because of that they are private companies. Of course, if our idea was that for the Dhaka case, if we go to through the transport authority, they have an overview of who these individuals are and how they can be brought into account. Whereas in the case of India, like rickshaw drivers, or there is no overall authority over this. These are all private individuals who are running these things. There, it is still a bit of a challenge. So what we thought was the commuter organizations would be a better places to bring these kind of voices or advocacy groups in. If you all have suggestions on how we could do it differently, that we would be very welcome. But especially in the Indian context, getting the informal or the private sector last mile and first mile and last mile connectivity groups is much more difficult. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question now from the floor, actually, which is about encountering grassroots movements and lobbying. And I know there's been a lot of that happened in the Chilean context, where there's been a lot of protests around transport and transport provision. I think also in the Caribbean context, Fiona, that there has been a lot of this too. And one of the questions from Waithira Dormo to everyone in the chat was, have you been bringing these grassroots organizations to the table as well? So maybe, thanks AJ, maybe Juan or Ale or Fiona would like to comment on that.
I may start, and then Alejandra can tell about the experience in Santiago, because we are looking at two different territories. In our case, it's interesting because when there may be not so many grassroots movements, especially looking at transport or mobility issues. It's basically housing, the more general dimensions about quality of life. But then suddenly they all realize that one of the main issues is transport and accessibility. So there's a dialogue over there. And I think, of course, when you start looking at the more traditional organizations within neighborhoods, but also the non-traditional grassroots movements in these neighborhoods, you tend to look at this and then, of course, work with them. And sometimes I feel that the main impact is really with them, is really empowering on looking at different ways of approaching the policymakers, or even approaching their own issues. So framing sometimes their own issues in different ways. Sometimes is one of the things that you could that we have learned and they have learned in these co-designing processes.
I think for me, I've heard a lot more through social media, very localized reaction to particular events. a bit like we've seen in the UK at the moment with the gas prices and the gas availability. I think there's been a tradition of that, particularly in Jamaica, where people will now go out and video themselves and get that out there because they feel that they're not being heard. In terms of grassroots movements and organizations, I think in Haiti, that sort of thing has been taking place. I think also in the Spanish-speaking countries, but I'm not so sure about the other islands. I know there's someone on from Trinidad, but I don't want to put her on the spot. So yeah, I think there is increased likelihood that there will be even more grassroots movements.
Great, and I noticed that Heather Allen is said in the chat that she could talk a bit about social media. So Heather, if you wanted to quickly unmute yourself, that would be great.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I can just share an interesting example from Africa, certainly from Nairobi, which actually had a huge impact on women's safety on public transport, on the informal public transport, on the matatus. It was called a campaign called My Choice, My Dress. And that actually led to significant legal changes. And basically it was whipped up through social media. And I think there are two interesting learnings from this. First of all is that the citizens, particularly around personal security, have a very low level of trust in the authorities. So once they can actually take some action, it can escalate and accelerate quite quickly. I think the other key learning is that a lot of the media in many of these countries, certainly in the African countries, is very politicized as well. And so the role of social media as a communication really does have an impact. And this, I believe, is actually going to grow. And it's an interesting discussion, I think, to look at how to inform and, using that horrible American word, capacitate, but increase the capacity of grassroots civil society organizations, NGOs, particularly around transport and personal security. And those things were, very clearly shown in Santiago, which the local authorities hadn't even thought about. The wild dogs in a rough area, children are just not going to go through that. And there is nothing in the way we collect data at the moment that actually conveys that message to the people who could do something about it. So I think that there's a really interesting intersection or nexus looking at how to inform those that are actually really on the ground, and the availability of social media, which we have today, which we didn't have 10 years ago, and the way that we can collect data, both qualitative and quantitative data, using those kinds of technologies. I think this is a really interesting emerging area.
That's really great, Heather. Thanks ever so much. That's lovely. Thanks for that input. I noticed Catherine, sorry, Alejandra, let me just bring in Catherine, who's been in the chat for a while talking about Trinidad and Tobago, and seems like this would be a great networking opportunity, Fiona, for us. And you're saying, Catherine, that there is no specific grassroots movement. I don't know whether you want to say something on camera or on volume, if you want to speak. Put your microphone on. Maybe not. But basically, Fiona, I think, the point being that a lot of those, Catherine, can you speak?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
hello, everyone.
Yes, we can.
Yes. So what I was trying to say in the chat is that we don't have specific grassroots movements related to transport, people advocating specifically for transport, apart from professionals like myself, transportation planners and transportation engineers, which is a core of about 10 solid professionals who advocate to the government and other associated organizations for changes in transport. But there's no grassroots one. where that is covered tends to be among issues that are aired by women's rights movements. We do have issues here with safety and security for women using public transport. And so that, along with other women's rights issues, are aired by grassroots movements, but those grassroots movements are gender-based, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Sammy, I should pass it back to you to be doing this chairing, I realise, hopping all over you.
Yes, thank you, Karen. I don't know, Regina, whether you are done with your discussion so that we can continue the general discussion.
I would like to add something about Chile.
Right.
I would say that cycling organizations have dominated the discussion, the public discussion in this issue in Chile for a decade, maybe. But during the sociopolitical crisis, the idea of territorial inequity was very strong. And after that, many local organizations have taken cycling as a part of them, but feminist organizations, environmental organizations, not necessarily with focusing transport. Catherine is sounding. But it's a component.
Sorry, please can everyone mute their microphones if they're not actually speaking? We love your children, but it's a bit distracting in the background.
But this cycling or walking component has been very strong, specifically in environmental and feminist local organization emerging after the crisis of 2019.
Tanu raised your hand some time ago. Yes, Tanu, please, let's hear you.
Thanks, Sammy. And sorry, Fiona, I didn't mean to raise my hand in your presentation. I was just checking if this works or not. It did work.
That's okay.
Yeah. I just wanted to come on that point you were making about how to create a network. And I think it's network is one thing, but it's also important to look at social programs which are going on in these developing countries and how to link them with transport and mobility. And that's something which has sprung up very interesting and innovative findings. Like in one of the tribal areas in India, in a state called Madhya Pradesh, the social program targeting girls and women, what they did was they took loan and bought electric auto rickshaws, which is being driven by the girls for the girls. Because the girls in the villages didn't have any access to schools or marketplace. So the girls got training to become driver. They bought these electric auto rickshaws with that social program money. And it's one of the roaring successes. So I think that kind of cross-fertilization is also very important to take forward in the networks. And also what kind of programs are existing through which they can tap into getting some funding for, actual solutions. That would be great. Thanks.
Thanks, Tanu, very much. Great suggestion, and something that I will look into definitely. You may even help, eh?
Yeah, Catherine, also you raise your hand. Let's hear you. Catherine Gattari.
Maybe she made a comment in, Catherine Gattari made a comment in the chat and said, was talking about transport and security violence in Kenya. It's interesting that this My Dress, My Choice movement hasn't actually gone into the sort of Southeast Asian, Indian context, because it's massive. It became a massive issue within Africa and really effective. And we see the media, AJ, portraying this sort of Eve teasing, they call it. Now, how you can put down something so that it seems like it's so ineffectual and it almost sounds quite nice. Eve teasing. Oh my goodness, it's all right if we rape women because we're just Eve teasing them. You know, and this whole portrayal in the Indian context, in the Bangladeshi context, of the fact that it's okay to harass and to severely harass women in that institution. It's a shame that this My Dress, My Choice has not moved on to that continent.
Yeah, basically what I was trying to say is that other than the social media, even the mainstream media, when we have issues of violence, be it from the borders, which is a lot, be it from the matatu industry, or even the Uber nowadays, the Kenyan media takes it very seriously. But regarding the grassroots lobby groups, as Waidira was asking, we really do not have them at the grassroots level, and maybe that is where the issue is. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Musle, I've seen your chat, your comment in the chat. Do you want to elaborate on this?
We don't hear you. We don't hear you, Musle. You have to check your microphone. Okay, now try.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I was talking about the protest actually made by the rickshaw pullers, I mean rickshaw wallai, we used to say here. In 80s, there was a ban started against rickshaw. You know, rickshaw is carrying right now 40% of the total trip in Dhaka. So the rickshaw pullers protested. But in 90s, the scientific studies regarding transportation plan started in Dhaka, and those have been financed by World Bank and of course facilitated by the government. And the actual plan was to have different infrastructures mainly. Although the policy said pedestrian first, but the ultimately investment plan showed that infrastructure actually is coming first. So this infrastructure is recently another plan. There is the strategic transport plan. It is saying that we'll have, or we need a rapid transit system, that is the metro. Again, that is very much investment hungry, you know, but the entire energy of the government actually put behind this metro, but for the last 10 years. But right now, government is perhaps realizing that only metro alone cannot solve the entire transportation problem. Now it is looking into other options, but rickshaw is traditionally neglected. Still, it is being neglected, and unfortunately, there is a kind of love-hate relationship in regarding rickshaw as well. When I am riding rickshaw, I love it, but when I am riding a car, then actually I hate it. So this is also, I mean, some kind of strange thing happening as people are having car ownership is increasing. This kind of things are happening. So in local area and for local journey, or I mean the mid-level of journey, rickshaw is heavily used, but this importance is not, I mean, rightly acknowledged. And another thing is also important, as Ajay and all other scholars have already mentioned, that is the first mile and last mile journey. Rickshaw trips are heavily, I mean, people are heavily dependent on rickshaw trips for first and last mile journey. Yet, since these two aspects, first mile and last mile, have never been, so far, never been accepted by these scientific transport plans. So rickshaw journey and rickshaw itself is still neglected. So there is always a very tremendous importance to reformulate the entire process of transport planning. And it's transport planning is so far being seen as transport engineering, but of course, transport engineering is a very important component, but transport planning, transport sociology, and transport governance, all this must be incorporated in the entire package of transport related decision makings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Transport planning is not transport engineering. Thank you very much. We are running out of time, so we'll take the last question from Padma goes by Padma, and any of the panelists can respond. He said, what kind of policy measures can be evaluated for paratransit fare regulation, especially in cities where there is no strict enforcement on fare control? Any of the panelists, Karen, can respond in 30 seconds.
So I think I wrote, you might want to say something else.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Actually, I'm working for a city of Imphal in India. So it's the capital of Manipur. So we recently had this project wherein I am supposed to look at the impact of, socioeconomic strata on the trips which are getting generated for paratransit. There basically they have only paratransit as the only mode of transport. So when I went into the site, I noticed that there is no fixed fares there. So people tend to, if they have one or two riders waiting in queue, then they escalate the price just to meet their own, expenditure. So in such a situation, it becomes very difficult to evaluate in terms of, the safetiness or cleanliness, because people tend to associate fares directly with the quality of service that is getting provided. So they feel that if it's an expensive ride, then they expect that it would be clean, it would be better. So they expect that. So it's kind of like a proxy for these kind of qualitative measures. And in India, the qualitative measures like, this safety, and it's all very, subjective. People have different opinions on safety. They have different opinions on cleanliness. So it's not like everybody has the same expectation. But by and large, fares are the ones which control and which dictate the quality of service they get. So what do we do when the quality of service is not up to the mark, and yet they have to shell out a lot and there is no policy measures on that? So is there some way where we can intervene, or we can some scientific way to mitigate it?
If I may,
yes,
I don't know if that is exactly the context, because of course these are different territorial contexts. But one of the things that, I don't know if that complements what Padma is saying, is, for example, Santiago de Chile has a great transportation system by all standards, a very good coverage and everything. But then we have a lot of paratransit, illegal paratransit. And by all engineering standards, you say, well, why? How come this is going on? And I think one of the key dimensions is that we still need to push in what Karen also was saying, in terms of the more holistic approach to public transport. Is not only fares, of course, it's a key part for deprived populations, but it's also schedules, safety, security, the territorial context, the needs of not only commuters, but all kinds of populations. And I think there's a number of reasons why sometimes paratransit does not really, on the one hand, feels a need that the traditional public transportation should do. On the other hand, may not feel other needs. So I think it's really part of our challenge to put a more holistic approach, raising that some of the key performance indicators that are used to public transport or public transport are just not enough to really get into the needs of some of the people. And that's what we see even in a city that is very well served by engineering standards.
Thank you very much, Juan. And we have just 2 minutes and time is up, unfortunately. I have to say unfortunately, because the discussion is getting interesting. But ladies and gentlemen, we started with a trip down memory lane to paradise. But beyond the nice scenes of paradise, there are also people who are struggling with transport and accessibility needs, and for which transport inequality is also coming up with so much emotional issues, so much aggression and the rest. And the fact that we have good transport system also doesn't guarantee that people don't have transport issues. And the point is that transport planning is not just about transport engineering. We have to consider the transport sociology, the transport anthropology, the transport chemistry and all that. And that calls for working with the real people in the transport sector. And who are the real people? It may be somebody, but the real people must start from us. Thank you very much. And I hand over to Karen to close the session for us.
Yes, thank you, Sammy. Thank you, Regina, for your discussions. Thank you for all the participants for a really interesting introduction to this seminar series. I see there are still messages in the chat that we probably haven't addressed, but this is an ongoing conversation. So this last slide that I've shared with you is about the rest of the series. And we will see that we have the similar sort of arrangement where we're focusing on different issues within the whole inclusifying urban transport agenda, which is the topic for next time in 2 weeks on the 14th. And then we're talking about widening inclusion, digital solutions, spatial planning and integration, particularly around all these other domains that we've been talking about that are not necessarily seen as traditional transport domains. And then thinking about a sort of panel discussion, which will be led by Juan and Fiona, who we've already got with us today, who will be bringing in sort of various participants to have a good old discussion for a whole hour and a half at the end. So hopefully we've done you well. I would like to thank you all as participants for coming. Please register at the following address, or if you just go onto the Interlink website, www.interlink.org, you will be able to find it. And finally, just to say thank you to Danielle Oviedo and University College London, UCL, for facilitating and hosting us on this particular session. So thank you to everybody, and hopefully we'll be able to join you soon. Thanks a lot. The participants I'm going to ask to stay on the line in the link, but I would like